Hey everyone, this is Walker from Bread and Thesis here doing a full sourdough lesson sponsored by Associated Students of Whitman College to keep you busy during this coronavirus time. So I'm going to start with just a brief outline of how the lessons are going to go, and then I'm going to get right into it. So we're going to talk about how to start and maintain a sourdough starter. And we're going to go through the process of making bread. I have a sourdough starter. You can see that it's gotten really excited that we're going to make bread with today. And I'm going to show you how all of the steps work from a physical, mechanical standpoint. And then I'm also going to briefly talk about what you need to bake bread, as well as a few simple concepts like baker's math that will help you understand bread formulas that you come across and help you pose questions and talk to people who bake bread. All right, so I'm going to jump right in with a quick introduction to sourdough, a little overview. What is it? How does it work? And how you can keep one. So a sourdough is a culture of yeasts and lactic acid bacteria that's used to leaven bread. These organisms metabolize sugar found in flour and produce carbon dioxide, which leavens the bread, and many flavor compounds, including acetate, which you may know as the chemical responsible for the sour taste in vinegar, which is what gives sourdough its distinctive taste. You maintain a sourdough by creating a predictable environment for the culture and refreshing its food supply regularly, which I think of as kind of like changing the water in a fishbowl. At least mechanically. They've sort of used up the nutrients and they have a bunch of sort of toxic to them, not to us, toxic waste that you have to clear out. And then you put more flour and suddenly they have more food and they're happy. So there are three simple rules that you should follow for keeping a culture that will predictably and successfully leaven bread. There are tons of ways to keep a sourdough, and a lot of it is up to you. And you can keep sourdough not following these three rules, and you'll get good bread some of the time. But if you want to sort of predictably and successfully leaven your bread, you should refresh your culture at least once a day. You should use whole grain flour, fresh if possible. I can't get fresh whole grain flour, so I just use Bob's Red Mill from the store. And then number 3 is to maintain it between 20 and 30 degrees Celsius. So this is 68 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit. This is a good little transition to talk about my approach to bread making and to this lesson. I'm going to go grab my starter real quick. It's my opinion that there are so many different resources out there for baking bread. And if you just want to get started and make a loaf, I mean, there are so many websites, so many books. Your friends maybe talk about how they make their bread and stuff. So I'm not going to try to reinvent the wheel or beat it into the ground. I'm going to go a little bit deeper and try to be a little more comprehensive and talk about what you need to do if you want to get a good loaf consistently. Because it's my view that bread is pretty forgiving and anyone can make a good loaf. But the key to, I think, what skilled bakers do is they can make a good loaf consistently over and over every time. And that to me is really satisfying. And so I'm going to try to teach some of the skills that I think can lead to being able to achieve that consistency. And with sourdough, that really starts with the starter, because that's the live organisms that are responsible for all of the chemistry that goes on in your bread. So getting that consistent will go a huge way towards making the rest of your process consistent. Okay, so to recap, 3 rules: refresh daily, use whole grain flour, and maintain between 68 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's pretty comfortable room temperature range. Other factors such as the ratio of the flour to water, which is called percent hydration, and we'll get exactly into how the percent works. It's called baker's math later. Those are up to the baker. So people can maintain a liquid starter that's at 100% hydration. In other words, a 1-to-1 flour to water ratio that's kind of like a wet slurry. I use 6 parts water to 10 parts flour, and so you'll notice that my starter kind of is like a thick cake, a puck at the bottom of the container I keep it in. The key is just to make sure that you keep the conditions similar each time, that you're feeding it the same way at roughly the same time so that it behaves predictably. When your starter is being fed regularly and kept at a healthy temperature, it will display a predictable pattern. Sometime after you feed it, you'll notice that the culture will start rising. And indeed, in my sourdough, I don't know if you can see because the lighting here is kind of funny, but there are little bitty bubbles just starting to form. I fed it 2 hours ago. So as it keeps growing throughout the day, it will metabolize sugars in the flour, and it will start rising, and it's probably going to go up to about here by about 9 or 10 p.m. And eventually, when the organisms have consumed a lot of the sugar and produce a lot of acid byproducts, that breaks down the flour, and you'll notice that the sourdough culture will fall. So it has this predictable pattern of rising and falling. And the ideal time to either feed your starter or to make a sourdough build to make bread, which basically is just feeding your starter, but making a bigger starter so that you have enough to leaven your batch of bread, is when it has risen and is just beginning to fall. It's just starting to fall, which means that it has a high cell density. It's going to be really good for leavening your bread, but the cells are still healthy. They haven't starved yet. They haven't totally run out of their food supply in the starter. So before you bake bread, you have this starter that you maintain regularly. But to leaven my batch of bread that I'm going to make, the flour is scaled out right there in that big tub. I'm going to need more than what I have here. So I made a sourdough build, which you can see is this much starter. And like I said, it's pretty much the same process as feeding your starter, but you're making more of it. And you'll pre-ferment the quantity of flour you need to leaven your bread. We're going to go into exactly what a pre-ferment is later, but essentially what you see in this big tub is not the total flour in the recipe, in the formula. Part of that flour ended up here in this sourdough, and this is what's called the pre-fermented flour portion of the formula. If you don't bake often, you can use various strategies to keep your starter dormant. This spring semester, when I was baking maybe once a month, I would store it in the fridge often after I dried it out. You can find tons of methods for that online or ask around. But when you're actually ready to bake, you should feed it using the 3 rules for several days prior to use, 3-4 days, several refreshments, and then it'll be healthy and kicking and ready to go for baking. So that way you don't need to baby it all the time, but when you're actually ready to bake bread, you put in that little extra effort to get that consistent result. To start a sourdough from scratch, you follow the same rules. Try to keep it on the warmer and wetter side when starting out, because that'll help it get going faster. So I usually use between 15 parts water to 10 parts flour when I'm beginning a new sourdough starter. And then I try to keep it closer to 85 degrees Fahrenheit warmer. If you use a whole grain flour, there's no need to use honey, grape juice, or any of the other bull crap that people recommend for getting a starter going. That's not necessary. All right, so thanks for listening to the first lesson on sourdough. We're going to move on to just a brief discussion of the materials and supplies that you should have on hand to make bread. So I'm going to start with a few items that I consider absolute musts, like things that you need to bake bread that you either need to buy or borrow from a friend if you don't have. First, a kitchen scale. This is mine right here. It is covered in flour. It's a little bit fancier and can handle a little bit more capacity because I do really big batches sometimes. but as long as it can accurately measure, preferably metric, then you're set. It's an absolute must if you'd like to use baking formulas, which are kind of the language that bakers use to talk about recipes. Improve your baking and diagnose errors in your process. Second, food safe thermometer. Again, this is essential for troubleshooting and achieving a full flavor consistently, and really just understanding, if your starter isn't going and you take the temperature and you see that it's like, it's 62 degrees Fahrenheit, that's your answer. So it can really just help troubleshoot and answer some of those questions. Third, a heavy baking stone or a Dutch oven pot with an oven-safe lid. I use a bench knife or dough scraper. It looks like this. It has usually a little, a pretty blunt edge here, and it kind of acts as an extension of your hand while you're baking. It's also nice to have a double-edged safety razor blade with a handle called a lame for scoring or cutting the dough before it goes into the oven, although you can achieve a similar effect with a pair of scissors. You should also gather buckets or large bowls for mixing and fermenting. I use these food-grade buckets right here, but for most smaller batches, a bowl is just fine. Plastic wrap or plastic bags for covering the dough as it rests. Proofing baskets, which are specialized linen-lined wicker baskets for rising bread, or just a bowl with a kitchen towel. And then a timepiece and notepad for tracking details as you bake, and a computer with Microsoft Excel or OpenOffice for computing baking formulas, which you may not need that at first, but eventually when you're like, I want to bake 3 loaves or 2 loaves, it helps you really accurately scale up or down your formula to exactly what you need. If you're using a baking stone instead of the Dutch oven, it's also useful to have parchment paper and a sheet pan for sliding dough pieces into the oven, as well as some way of generating steam in your oven. I'll go into that when I do it, but I like to use an old cast iron pan that I keep in the bottom of the oven. It's totally wrecked from being used for this for years, and that's its dedicated purpose. If your oven is heated using gas, it will be very difficult to bake bread unless you use a Dutch oven because the steam tends to put out the flame in the gas oven. As far as ingredients are concerned, you will probably start out, you'll want white flour, appropriate for making bread, whole grain flour for maintaining your starter, and a fine non-iodized salt. I just get sea salt in bulk. I'm pretty sure Andy's sells it. King Arthur flour makes an all-purpose flour, which is their red bag, which works really nicely. Or you can get 50-pound bags of Small's Family Farm all-purpose flour from Andy's Market in College Place, or 50-pound bags of Shepherd's Grain low-gluten flour from Cash and Carry in Richland. If you can't find any of those, you should look for a brand milled from hard red winter wheat containing between 11 and 12% protein. Excess protein tends to make for a less sweet, chewier bread. So you don't need high gluten flour or what is often sold as bread flour, but is in fact harder than you need. Keeping a bit of white rice flour on hand is also a good idea for preventing your bread from sticking to your rising baskets. As far as whole wheat flour is concerned, which again I recommend for feeding your starter, I use Bob's Red Mill, which you can get in bulk at Andy's. Before we get started actually seeing and handling the dough, we're going to go over the steps of the baking process from start to finish. These steps apply both for yeasted bread and for sourdough, although of course I'm going to use my sourdough as an example. The steps are, in order, scaling, pre-ferment, mixing, bulk fermentation, dividing and shaping, proofing, baking, and cooling. First things first, look over the formula the night before to make sure you've made enough pre-ferment for the batch, and get your flour and salt scaled while you're at it. It'll make the next morning more pleasant since you can get straight to mixing and not worry about forgetting to scale the salt. Next, prepare that pre-ferment. A pre-ferment, we touched on this briefly in the last section, but a pre-ferment is what it sounds like. It's a portion of the batch's total flour that is fermented ahead of time to inject some extra flavor into the dough, and in the case of purely sourdough leavened bread, to build leavening power. Pre-ferments often stand for 8 to 16 hours before use, so they get plenty of time to develop flavor that gets wrapped up into the dough. If you were to, say, put straight sourdough starter straight in the oven, which would be like pre-fermenting all of your flour, it would be really gross and sour. So you kind of got a nice balance where you can pre-ferment some of it, get it really fully fermented, and then you still have the flour that gets fermented less, and you don't have to worry about it losing its structure because of all the acidity. The next day, mix your dough. Sometimes mixing is done in multiple sub-steps. Some bakers add a prehydrating autolyse step. Sometimes some of the dough's water is withheld until a separate mix at the end, where it is added back with the salt. This is called bassinage. And sometimes the dough is mixed in multiple phases at different speeds on a mechanical mixer. Whatever the case, mixing is designed to A, homogeneously incorporate different ingredients and moisten the flour, B, achieve the correct final dough temperature, and C, achieve some level of gluten development. Gluten proteins, when mechanically aligned through mixing and folding, trap gas in the dough, leading to the bread's predictable rise. The next step is the most critical one, bulk fermentation. It's called this because the entire dough mass, no matter how many pieces of bread it's ultimately destined for, get fermented in one bulk mass. During bulk fermentation, the bread will develop its flavor, and in the case of sourdough breads, its structure. Temperature is the most critical factor in determining the outcome of bulk fermentation, since it determines the enzyme activity and metabolic profile of sourdough microorganisms. This is why it is important to mix your dough with this ideal temperature in mind. Some call it final dough temperature. During bulk fermentation, you may also elect to fold the dough one or more times, which will continue developing the bread structure after mixing. Dividing and shaping brings a large mass of dough into several smaller pieces that will become each finished loaf. Some bakers add a pre-shaping and a short bench rest step, others forego it. I'm going to skip it today and go straight to shaping, demonstrating the method for a round boule and an oblong bâtard. Forgive my French, I don't speak French, but there are a lot of French words in baking terms. Once shaped, the dough pieces will undergo a final fermentation, also called proofing, in linen-lined baskets or in the folds of a linen cloth called couche. The dough will rise more in this step, and gluten, strengthened from bulk fermentation, will begin to break down again as the dough acidifies. Proofing is often carried out for an extended period of time under refrigeration in order to streamline bakery workflow, in which case it is called retardation. The choice of proofing temperature significantly impacts the flavor of the bread. The dough pieces get scored, or scarified if you're British, using a safety razor blade, then baked in a hot, steamy oven, followed by more time in a dry, venting oven to finish developing color through the Maillard reaction. Last, but not least, the dough must cool in order to set the crumb. After that, it's yours to devour. I'll recap each of these steps as I demonstrate them today, as well as the logic behind them. Okay, one more thing before we get started. We need to talk about baker's math. Baker's math is a system for scaling and comparing bread formulas. The essence of baker's math: all ingredients are compared against flour. The total of the flours in the dough is always equal to 100%, and all other ingredients are expressed as a percentage of the total flour. So a dough with 7 parts water to 10 parts flour is 70% water or 70% hydration, right? Because it's all expressed as a ratio compared to the total flour. It's confusing at first because 70% hydration does not mean 70% of the dough is water, as you might think. That would be totally unmanageable and would not make bread. That would be a batter. It means for every 10 parts flour, you need to add 7 parts water. Once you begin to use baker's math, though, it's very easy to scale a formula up and down, compare formulas across bakers at a glance, and adjust formulas for changes in flour or to your preference. It's a nifty tool and a sort of universal language among bakers.